Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hey everybody, welcome to the podcast. My name is Nick. I'm the host, and it's episode 53, meaning we just passed 1 year of the podcast. I can't believe it. It's gone by so fast. We've had so many amazing guests and people come on the podcast to talk children's ministry or student ministry or family ministry, and it's just been a lot of fun. And I just want to say thanks. Thank you for listening, for sharing the podcast, for commenting, for being guests, many of you obviously. I'm just so grateful. I hope it's helpful to you. I started the podcast to help all of us who serve in a family ministry type role in a church to learn and get better, to learn from each other and to get better as leaders and to help serve our churches better. So it's been an amazing year. And here we are, episode 53. And this episode is going to be unique. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But to celebrate 1 year of the podcast, we're giving away a bunch of free stuff. So all week, each day this week, we're giving away free stuff. Yesterday, I had a post on my blog about productivity. So if that's something you're interested in, you can check that out. But even if you're not interested in it, what I put on the blog post, you'll definitely be interested in the chance to win a copy of Carey Nieuwhof's course, The High Impact Leader. I have The High Impact Leader. I've been through it. It's an amazing course. And we're giving away a free copy of that. All you have to do is go to that post on my blog and comment and leave a comment with your name and what is one tool or app or trick or a practice that helps you stay productive. So comment there, and then on Friday this week, we'll pick somebody randomly and give away a copy of Carey's course, The High Impact Leader. Today, we're going to give away a $50 Amazon gift card, and we're going to give it away to somebody who's left an iTunes comment previously, so you can't win it now. We're going to give it away to the username jhark423. So if that's you, I hope you're listening, because otherwise I don't know how to identify you. But go ahead and email me, and we'll give you that $50 gift card. Whoever that is, jhark423 left a great review and a rating on iTunes, which is so helpful for spreading and sharing the podcast. So we want to give that away. Stay tuned tomorrow and the rest of the week on the email list, on social media. We're going to be giving away stuff as well. So check that out. And all of that's just to say thanks. You all are incredible. You listen, you share. The podcast has grown so much in just the year, that we've been doing it. And it's been a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Well, in this episode, it's going to be unique because we don't have a guest. Unfortunately, it's just me, but we do get to hit some of your questions. I asked for questions. I asked for suggestions for guests. And all year, you've been sending in great questions, great suggestions for people to have on the podcast, but we haven't been able to hit all your questions. And so what I do in this episode is I answer basically 5 questions, though they're kind of broad, and tell you about how we do it at our church, what we've learned, where we still need to grow. I wish I could get a guest on for each question. But the good thing is we get to hit all these questions in a little, I'll say a short amount of time, but it's not really a short amount of time. It's a little bit of a longer episode. And in case you want to hit a specific question, you can go to the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 53. And in there, we put the timestamp in the podcast for each subject. So if you want to skip forward to something, you can check out those show notes. Here's what we hit just to give you an idea. First, we talk about training volunteers, a bunch of different questions related to how to train volunteers. That's about 10 minutes long. And then after that, we talk about finding and recruiting and developing coach-level volunteers, like volunteers who lead other volunteers. And that one's longer. We talk about that, meaning me. I ramble on about that for about 20 minutes, but I talk about how we implemented that at our church and what that looks like now. So we talk about that for about 20 minutes. Then we address the question of how do I know if it's healthy, if the ministry's healthy, if it's working, how do I measure that? So we talk about a few measurements that I think are key. And that's also about 10 minutes, maybe 12 minutes. Then we talk about how to follow up with new families. And I talk about what we do, but also some things that I've seen other churches do that I think are really helpful. And we wrap it up addressing a question that I get a lot, or at least some version of it. And that question is, what do I do if the church that I've come on staff with is not exactly what I thought it was going to be? the role's not exactly what I thought it was going to be. The health of the church isn't what I thought it was going to be, whatever that might be. That's a tough situation. We talk about that. That's about 10 minutes to wrap it all up. So all of the 5 sections are about 10 minutes with the exception of that second one. The coach one's about 20. So if you're going to skip ahead and you can't get to the show notes to see the exact times, that'll give you some idea. And I'd love to get more questions. So as we hit these, I hope it's helpful to you. But go ahead and always email in or tweet or however you can send them to me. Send questions that you have as well as suggestions for who you'd like to hear from for guests. We're coming up on a new year. We've got a lot of interviews already ready to go for this new year, but I'd love to hear some more suggestions of what would help you. So without further ado, we're going to jump into this Q&A time. And again, thank you for listening to the podcast. And I'm excited to give away all this stuff this week just to say thanks. You all are incredible. It's been a lot of fun. But let's jump in and answer some of the questions that you sent in. Well, today's podcast is a little bit unique. I'm joined by Rachel Walker. Before we jump in, Rachel, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Rachel, like Nick said, and I am just wrapping up a leadership development program down at Gwinnett Church, which is one of the 6 Atlanta area campuses of North Point Ministries. So I've been in Atlanta for 9 months, just learning from them, specifically in the elementary environment upstreet. And then I'm going to be headed back to Maryland, actually, to help launch a church in Owings Mills, Maryland called United. And I'll be leading kids there and just helping with that launch. So yeah, I'm really excited about that.
And you've had to suffer, in quotes here, under the leadership of Jeff Henderson at Gwinnett Church, which I'm sure has been amazing, actually. That's been great.
Yeah, that's been awesome.
That's cool. Awesome. And the leadership development program there has been really good. And for anybody who's not familiar, some of you will know Rachel because we've done some webinars, and Rachel, you've been part of those. Some of you don't realize that you know Rachel because Rachel helps with the blog and the podcast and making me sound a little bit better than as bad as I normally do and putting it all together and all of that stuff. Plus there's some free stuff that we try to give away from time to time. We have one coming up, Rachel, that you've done great work on about like what churches do to follow up with first time families. So like all of that kind of stuff, people probably don't realize that they know you, but through the resources and the podcasts and stuff, you've been a great help there. So that's really fun. We're excited that you're headed back this way to be part of a church plant. I know Gwinnett Church is sad to see you leave, and I'm not just saying that, but we've had conversations where I'm like, it's not my fault. She's not coming back to work at our church. Like I wish she's coming back to work at another church, but we need more church plants. So that's awesome. And I'm glad you're joining me today as we can talk about some questions. We wanted to celebrate 1 year of the podcast, which is just like, that's awesome. It's gone by really fast. I don't know, Rachel, if you think it's like gone by fast because you've helped with it the whole time. Has it felt fast to you, or is that just me?
Oh, it has flown by. I can't believe that this is our 53rd episode. That's crazy. There's been so many awesome guests.
And anybody that listens to Carey Nieuwhoff's podcast as well, which everybody should. I'm amazed how like he always knows what episode, maybe not anymore, but for the first year he could know like, oh yeah, that was episode 17 or that was episode 25. Like I know all the interviews, but I can't tell you what number they are. That's really funny. It's gone by quick, and we talked about a lot of great topics, which has been a lot of fun. Had people on that are just doing an amazing job in ministry. But if you subscribe to my email list, and I send emails with some free content and resources and try to help however I can, one of the questions I ask is, what do you want to hear about on the podcast or on the blog? And so for over a year now, we've been getting questions and things like that. And many of them I've used as a guide to go pick a guest, right? But some of them we haven't been able to hit, or at least not specifically, in terms of how they ask. So we collected a bunch of questions, and Rachel has those. And from different people, you sent them in via email or Twitter or through the blog, or maybe you just, you replied to that email that I sent. And so we're going to try to hit some of those, and I'll do the best I can to answer them, to share what we've done at our church, because I know that practical stuff is what you're looking for. And some of these we have touched on in other interviews, but hopefully this will be new stuff that'll be really helpful. So why don't we go ahead and jump into the first one? What's the first question?
Yeah, so the biggest question was about training volunteers. We got several about that. So we kind of narrowed it down to 3 that we'll just hit on here. So Carrie asked, how do you train volunteers when time is limited outside of Sunday? Which I know is a big struggle for a lot of ministry leaders. And then Adam asked just for practical tips, practical ideas for how to train volunteers. And then Bob also mentioned, how do we train volunteers in a digital world? So obviously it looks different as technology grows. So what are your thoughts on that?
This is probably, it's one of the reasons we're hitting it first, probably the most popular question, or it's certainly pretty far up there. You could probably do like 5 podcasts and have different guests. And I mean, it's just such a big topic, but these are great questions. I know everybody struggles with volunteer training, what works. A lot of times you think about, most of us, you think about training in the church as an event. So like Jim Weidman will joke that only in the church world do you only think about training as like an event. In other, spaces and business and things like that, that's not necessarily how they think about it. But I know if you do, it's very common for churches to only get 25 or 30% of their people to show up for a training. So that makes it hard. So here are my thoughts, just some different things. When it comes to training volunteers, I think the number one thing is onboarding. That's the best time to train people, because they're going to come in, they have to go through whatever you want them to go through in order to serve. And obviously you don't want them to have to jump through a million hoops. Otherwise they won't end up serving. But that's the best time when they're open. They're nervous probably about what they're going to do, and they want training. They want help. Andy Stanley says adults learn on a need to know basis. Well, at this moment, they need to know, like they don't want to be unprepared. So I think having a good orientation to your ministry is helpful. Is that one-on-one? Is that in some kind of a class type setting? I would never use the word class, but is it there? And the key word for me is vision. I don't think orientation is about the details and the logistics and the fundamentals and all that. I think it's about vision. Why does this matter? Like why should you serve on this team, and what is the difference that you can make if you join student ministry or children's ministry at our church? I think that's huge. The other thing is, I don't love handbooks, but we do have them, but just somehow you got to get across the fundamentals. So having some kind of documented, or at least clear way of passing on the fundamentals, the logistics, the policies, the security and all that, that's important in the beginning. But the best way to even do that, I think, is this third thing, and that's apprenticeship. So can you build in, most of us, when we recruit a volunteer, we need them to serve right now. Like there's more openings than there are new volunteers. So the temptation is to just plug them in and let them get help. However, if we can, it's better to give them a chance to apprentice with another leader. You know what I mean? Like let them serve alongside somebody who's doing exactly what they're going to do. You can even let that be the season that they go through the handbook or whatever. So it means more, like it's happening while they're learning it, as opposed to just walking through a book kind of cold in one sitting. That's been helpful for us. We do a 6-week apprenticeship. It's also designed to see if it's going to be a good fit for them. And then their leader, who would be their coach, at the end of the 6 weeks meets with them. And that's probably the next thing I would say about training that's really helpful is one-on-ones. I know they're hard. We have always struggled as a church to make sure we're meeting one-on-one with other volunteers regularly, even at 6 months, every 6 months at least. Every volunteer should have a one-on-one meeting. But I've found some of the best churches. We had Allison Evans on the podcast from Life Church. And if you listen to that episode, you can get a sense that most of their leadership development, and I think that's like the number one thing in Life Church, most of it's driven through one-on-one meetings, like having a leadership development culture, having this mindset that we want to get better. I loved how Allie said that part of their leadership development, like one of the things they just believe in is that we own our own development. So as a new volunteer, you teach them that their leadership development, their growth is dependent on them, not us. That way we meet one-on-one and we can give them resources or point them to some things they can use to grow or get better. But ultimately they own it. We don't. So I think that's really helpful. One-on-ones are hard. They take time. I think it's good to find ways maybe to meet with people on Sunday, in between services, after services, early in the morning, something like that, because I know it's hard, to schedule those. But I think one-on-ones are some of the best ways to train volunteers because you can listen to them. How are you doing? Where do you need help? Where are you frustrated? I think those are some of the things that we want to be able to ask and then train them specific to those needs that they have. We all do events. Most of us do some kind of training events. I would say, I know one of the struggles there, Adam mentioned like practical ideas for training. is like what to do. Like what do you train with? Most of us can get food or create some element of fun. I think it's always important to share stories and wins and cast vision. But then you think about what is the practical thing we're going to train with. I recommend really two options. One is I think you should always be learning as a leader, always like listening to podcasts, reading books, reading articles. And when you come across something that you think that would be good for our team, you make a note, you save it somewhere, Evernote, email, so you print it and save it somewhere, whatever it might be. And then when you have a training, you can use that content in the training and you can teach it. Another option is, and I don't think we do this enough, is you go get a book or a training or something that's available out there. There's so much more available now in ministry world than there was before that you don't have to think of it yourself. A lot of us aren't designed to create, training or leadership content, but you don't have to. You can go get great resources from Download Youth Ministry, from Orange. There's just countless places where you can buy helpful content to train your team. And I think it's perfectly fine to take, that book and what that book talks about, and then you present it right there in the meeting. And you can always point people to the book as well. And then in terms of like how to train volunteers in a digital world, like Bob talked about, I think that is, definitely up and coming. It's a big new thing. I love seeing churches that are doing some unique things there. I know somebody who they did a Facebook Live training for their children's team. So it was one night during the week, specific time. They had a Facebook group for their volunteers, trying to make sure everybody was in there, and just said, we're going to go live on Facebook at 7 p.m. for an hour or whatever. And they did the training right there, and people can comment while it's going on. And so if you have other people on your team, they can kind of engage in the comments there. And then it's also available to rewatch later. So if everybody doesn't watch it live, they can come back and watch it later. You could do that with Vimeo. You could pre-record it, upload it to YouTube or Vimeo, give people a link. There are some great websites like Ministry Grid, Trained Up, I think Good to Go by Group are all three examples of like online training storage or platforms for ministry. So you could create, short videos, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, about different things to help train volunteers, upload it there, and then use those platforms to send it to people. And I think most of them will even track like who's watched it, who hasn't, all that stuff. So I think those are great ideas that are being used out there that are really helpful. Any version of a webinar, which is kind of like Facebook Live. I love seeing all that kind of stuff. I don't think you can do everything and do it well. So let me say that. However, I think if you can do a variety, that's good. So if you can do one-on-ones, do onboarding well, have one-on-one meetings, that alone would be really, really good. And then if you could do a mix of like in-person together trainings and digital, on demand almost, or maybe Facebook Live type trainings, I think that's the way to go. Cause then you can, speak to different people and try to catch as many as possible. So those are just some ideas. I know training is a huge topic, but those are some ideas that we've used, as well as some other ones that I've seen others use that I think can be really helpful.
That's so helpful. I know I've seen that firsthand when I volunteered under you and then leading at Gwinnett, and just talking with other church leaders. Vision and training really is so key so that your volunteers know that what they do matters and feel set up for success.
Real quick, before we jump on too, the other thing I think about is Jim Weidman will sometimes use this quote of Ed Young Jr. that he said, the larger your church gets, the more time you have to spend on leadership development. And I know we're going to address another question about that in a minute, but I think that's something to think about too, is if your church is larger, and I'm not going to define that because I don't even really know which point. I think you got to spend more time on leadership development the whole time. So this year you should spend more than last year, and so on. But I think he's right. You have to spend more time, the larger your church gets, on leadership development, and less time, like in the weeds, so to speak, doing the ministry yourself. And so the more you can like consume content and learn, the more you can commit and carve out time to do training like this, I think, the church will be better for it.
That's so true. I think that caring for and developing your volunteers is huge. But like you said, when you're running a ministry and you've got a million things going on, it can be hard to personally get to do that with each of your volunteers. So it's great when you can build into other leaders to lead volunteers or volunteers who lead other volunteers. So we actually had a question about this, about volunteer leaders, or a lot of people call them coaches. How do you recruit and develop these leaders or coaches?
Yeah, this is a question I've heard a lot. And I understand because this is, I would say, one of the new things, so to speak, in church world is this idea of like a leadership pipeline and having a structure. And I don't think it's very new at all. In fact, it's very biblical, but it's definitely becoming more and more popular in churches. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's important for churches to develop and hand off leadership. We've had some great podcast episodes on this. Allison Evans was one. We had Todd Atkins from Lifeway, and they talk all about leadership pipelines, and that was a great interview. And so we've had some good conversations about it. But I know one of the things that I hear often is, okay, I understand what a leadership pipeline is. Kind of like you said, Rachel. It's like we need volunteers to lead volunteers. Like I can't lead them all myself. But how do I do it practically? You know, if I call them coaches, great. If I call them coordinators, great. But how do I actually get them and how do I train them? So here's what I'll say. I think this one matters almost regardless of church size. If you lead more than 10 volunteers, I think you should be thinking about how do you lead volunteers who lead volunteers. There was a point in our church, we were a new church, 11 years ago, and there was a point where I was directly leading 60 volunteers. And it was terrible for them. It was terrible for me. But it was more terrible for them because I could not lead 60 volunteers well, care for them, all that stuff. That was not something that I could do for 60 volunteers. So I put this into place over probably like 3 or 4 or 5 years. So it took a while, but it didn't have to take that long. So I'm just going to give you a few things that we did. They're not like, I don't know. It's not like it's magic. It's not like these are like amazing ideas or, we just kind of did what seemed right at the time. And so especially if you're kind of in that place where you directly lead all of your volunteers, whether it's 20 or 100, this can help. If your church is larger and you have multiple staff, I think it can still help because even if you have multiple staff, again, everybody who is staff should be leading volunteers who lead volunteers. That way nobody is directly leading volunteers themselves. So here's some things that we did. One is that we first created the structure that we wanted. And we used the term coaches like you referenced, Rachel. So for us, a volunteer, we use the word volunteer for someone who serves on a team, but is not directly responsible for any group of people, kids, adults, whatever. I think we could change that to team member or something like that. So it does, since they're all volunteers, that can be confusing. So that's the first level. Leader is the next level. Leaders lead a team of volunteers or they lead a group of kids or students. And then leaders are led by coaches. And then for us right now, coaches are led by staff. And I know other churches have like another level in there. It's coordinator. It's, something else, which is great. But I think that structure is important. And what you call it, I think does matter. I love the word coach, but I think what matters the most is that it's consistent and it makes sense. Don't call it a coach in this ministry and a coordinator in that ministry, or a coach in that age group and a coordinator in that age group. If it's the same level of leadership, call it the same thing. So for us, we just said we need coaches. We had volunteer directors. I'm going back to when our church was, smaller. We were probably 700 or something. We had volunteer directors for the ministries there, age group ministries, and we had volunteers, but we didn't have anybody in between. So we wanted to add these coaches. We were going to call them coaches, and here's some ways we did that. First, we kind of decided how that would be structured. So for us, it was kind of simple. We were mostly going to have coaches over to lead volunteers at each service and each age group. So you'd have a preschool coach would lead all the preschool volunteers and leaders at one service. Another one would lead another service. And, if you have a lot more, if your church is larger, and we had this too, but if you might have multiple coaches at one service. So we defined that and we said, we got to go get some of these people. So the number one thing you can do is you can ask individuals that have shown some leadership ability. Maybe they've been great leaders. Maybe they're leaders outside the church, and you just ask them one-on-one, you write a job description for this role of coach and you ask them to step into this role and you give them authority over, whatever that team is that they're going to lead. We also did, I had like a leadership team for children's ministry. This is back when I only led our children's ministry. This is almost a decade ago now, but I had what I called a leadership team, and it was specific key volunteer leaders from all areas of the ministry that I thought showed leadership potential. And I think there was about 7 or 8 of us, and we met almost monthly, and you can meet quarterly, bi-monthly, monthly, something in there is what I would recommend. And you just pour into them. I got their input. I got their advice. We brainstormed things together. We planned together, but largely I just invested in them. Things that I read, we read together. Podcasts I listened to, we listened to together. We can link to a post on my site. It's actually a really old post, but it's like 20 some ideas for leadership development. Pretty much all of them are from way back when I did this team. So they're really old, but they're really good. It's the same kind of stuff. And I'm sure many of you who are listening, could make a list of the things that you've learned that you could take a team through. I mean, you can read books together, anything like that. So that was really helpful because through that group, I could see who really got it, who understood the vision, who would make a good leader. And then I invited them to lead. Another thing I did, it was a 6-week group. We called it different things, but essentially it was a group designed to help you discover how God's wired you and how he could use you, to carry out his mission. What are your gifts? What are your passions? And so we used, and we can share this in the show notes. I can give you the 6-week plan for this group that I developed, but essentially it came from the book Call Zone by Craig Groeschel. And that book kind of outlines how to evaluate your gifts and your past experiences and your values and all of that to determine how God might want to use you. And then the second half of the book is about like how to get your life ready to be used by God. So we kind of used the first half, had a group that met once a week for 6 weeks. We basically did the homework each week, talked about it together. Those groups were amazing. I mean, people connected in such a big way because you're really sharing your whole life story in a sense, because you're talking about your past and your gifts and your personality. And through that group, it was easy to say, I think you should be a coach in this ministry. And here's why. I see this in you, and I think you make a great coach here. So we definitely got a few coaches from that. We got a few from like this leadership team idea. We got a few from this development group idea. And then the other thing we did, I don't always recommend this one because it can go a little weird. We did one of our volunteer trainings. We got everybody to come and we put up kind of the new org chart with this new role of a coach. And we put, we made it clear where the empty boxes were. And I already had a couple people in mind because of these other ideas. So some of them were already filled, even though I didn't fill them, in this presentation. And I talked about Exodus 18 and Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, telling him, you need leaders of 10s and 50s and hundreds and thousands because, you can't do this alone. And I talked about how we can't do it alone either. There are too many volunteers and we want to care for you well. We want to serve you well. And so that's why we need this new role of a coach. And we talked about Acts chapter 6 and when they are neglecting the widows and the distribution of food and it's not being handled and they need to bring on new people and they bring on the 7 and they empower them to lead. And I just love the way that ends when it says the word of God spread rapidly and the number of disciples or the word of God spread and the number of disciples increased rapidly. I think there was a cause and effect there that when they were trying to do it all themselves, it limited the growth of the church. When they empowered others, it allowed that to spread. And obviously that doesn't all depend on us, but I just know from experience that we were limiting the growth of our ministry because we didn't have that level. So I made that case, like we need coaches. Here's what it looks like. It's not for everyone. It's at least 3 hours a week. It's a big commitment. And the dangerous part is you could get, some people that you don't want to be coaches might say, hey, I think I want to do that. So then you gotta say no. But, and I don't remember if we did or not. Honestly, I can't quite remember, but we definitely got a couple people that I was hoping would step up and say yes. And they jumped in there. And so that one's a little bit more messy. And I would use that last. That would be like my last resort because open calls are usually terrible. But we cast a vision around it. I thought I was pretty clear about what the role required. And, looking back, we got coaches from all 3 of those things. So that's how we recruited them. In terms of like developing them, I think it goes back to doing the same things. It just looks different. So what are your one-on-one meetings? When do you meet together, as maybe a whole team and learn together? Is that quarterly? Is that every other month? What is that? What are some books you can read together? I just think you can't really mass produce leadership development. I think it really comes down to who are you investing in intentionally? Who are they investing in intentionally? And it's a little risky because anytime you spend on that, you're not spending on preparing for Sunday or executing on Sunday or whatever it might be. But in the end, you realize it pays off. It's definitely worth taking the time out and investing in here. So that's kind of what we've done. I tell people that we took like 8 years to get the coach model to where we wanted it to be, but it didn't have to take 8 years. I do think though, you have to be patient because I do think it would take at least a couple to 3 years, at a minimum to kind of implement that from scratch and get it done well. So those are some things we did. There's a couple posts we can link to about like our coach values that we came up with, a coach meeting that we have 3 times a year. Those have both been really helpful as well in kind of creating the culture that we want. So we can link to that as well, but that's what we've done. I hope that's helpful. I love hearing what other people do too. So they should, email and tell me what they've done as well.
Nick, you mentioned the coach values. I know that was a part of the 8-year process of figuring out what the coach role looked like. So they were recruited and then they were trained, but then it was like, what do coaches focus on? Do they focus on coordinating? Do they focus on communicating, on making Sunday happen? Or is their primary role to lead and build into those volunteers?
Yeah, that's a good question because I don't think it's uniform across the board. So a coach who leads, let's say, 10 elementary small group leaders will be, in our mind, most of their role is behind the scenes. It's during the week, leading a huddle on Sunday, casting vision, praying for them, caring for their leaders. That should be the number, the highest priority is leading them, most of which is going to happen, behind the scenes. But for us, our coaches do have an execution role during the services on Sunday. So, and same for student ministry. Now the ideal is you don't want them having to fill in all the time, right? Or just to the point where it's like they never get to work on it. They are always in it, just plugging holes. But it is a huge benefit to have coaches because they can plug holes when needed so that staff doesn't have to do that. So ours are a mix. We have coaches who, like, for instance, your sister, who lead on the large group side. And so there's far more to the execution on Sunday because it's kind of like a producer. Lorianne's a producer and a coach. So she has a responsibility to lead the volunteers, but she also has a responsibility to produce the large group experience on Sunday. So I think it depends on the role, but yes, ideally you want it to be far more leadership, far less execution or details, if you can. But for us, it's always a mix. We don't have any coaches who all they do is coach, but I think that's good. I mean, if somebody could have that, great, make sure they might be able to even lead more people than 6 or 8 or 10. If that's what they did, they might be able to even influence more people, and spend more time on that. I think that'd be great too. But I've found it to be a mix. The problem we had, which I think you kind of alluded to, is we realized that our coaches were doing like 95% execution, plugging holes. So for 2 or 3 years, like, we thought it was good, and it was good. It was better than before, but they weren't really leading,
Right.
And they were caring. So that was good for caring for their team. That was good, but they weren't really leading or developing. And so we made some shifts, developed the values, which kind of helped just remind them that, it's not just about, execution. In fact, most of those values are not execution based. They're like partner with parents, communicate with your team, recruit volunteers, care for your team, develop your team. Like, those are some of the volunteers. And most of that doesn't happen in the environment, on a Sunday. So, or if it does, it's really like the before and the after, some of those opportunities. So that's been, and having the meeting 3 times a year has been great too, because there's mutual accountability. People come, they sit with all the other coaches, they talk about how the last 4 months have gone. And there's just this accountability of like, okay, you've done that. How have I been doing? Like, I want to do this job well. You've been able to meet with your team and care for them. It makes me think about how I've been doing. and pushes me, to grow together. But at the same time, it's not like it's a negative thing. You know what I mean? So that's been good. I mean, that's really helped us. And I think, if you have a larger church, you can still do it. You just do it by ministry area or, however that's defined. So you have a bunch of different coach meetings as opposed to maybe one for everyone.
I think I know it's been awesome as their role has shifted more to leadership development, but that those coaches value when they are able to fill in for their teams because, for example, a small group coach, when they end up having to sit in a circle, maybe just like once every 4 months, it puts them back in the position of their leaders and helps them know how to serve them better. So I think that's great.
It does. And they wish it was once every 4 months. But I would say the good thing is it's not once every 4 weeks is probably more realistic, but that's okay. Like any more than that, they're probably plugging holes too much. And for anybody who has, if you have coaches or you implement them, we have found that coaches in like preschool age, because there are more rooms, right? So our elementary small groups are in larger rooms and, a bunch of groups in one room. And I don't know, for whatever reason, it's just, if people are out in elementary, it's not as often that a coach has to step in there. Usually sometimes groups have multiple leaders or they can combine and make a kind of a big group that week or whatever. Preschool, it's much more difficult because the rooms are smaller. There are more rooms, so a coach is responsible for multiple rooms. And we have found that you really do have to lead coaches well to make sure their rooms are ready to go. Because the tendency would be like, on Friday they get a text and somebody's not going to be in one of their rooms. And they're like, well, I can fill it if needed. And I think that's a bad mindset. The mindset needs to be, no, I need to fill that before Sunday because something else could come up, right? And now there are 2 holes and I can't fill 2 spots. Or just, hey, you want to get somebody else in there so that you can spend your time being a coach, like we designed to. So I would say anybody that implements this, especially with like younger age, preschool, nursery, toddlers, things like that, you got to really work against that tendency. Because, if we're honest, sometimes it's easier to just do it ourselves than go ask someone to step in. It's hard. Sometimes it's hard to ask someone to fill in when somebody else is going to be out or whatever. And we just have to, I think, push and encourage people to ask, and to be a coach and to lead and not just jump in themselves.
For sure. So we're actually going to shift gears a little bit now. This question actually comes from Talia. She just wants to know, how do you measure if you are winning in ministry? So you have all these volunteers and leaders and coaches, and you have cast the vision to them. But how do you measure if you are effectively leading well and building a strong ministry?
That's a great question because it's very hard to know. Sometimes it's not like business, where there's profits or losses. It's not like sports where there's a scoreboard and, there are different things you can measure, and we'll talk about some of that. But I think the number one way is stories. I think you gotta hear stories. You gotta tell stories, and they are the best indicator of how well you're doing. And what we learned is that it doesn't just happen. People don't just, like if something great happens and they hear about it, their inclination is not naturally to tell you or to save it and share it later at a meeting, so more people can hear. We just don't have a culture, at least our church didn't, of sharing stories naturally. So we had to build it up. And so for us, what we did is every time volunteers huddle before a service or student ministry volunteers huddle before their gatherings, every week in our staff meeting, our family ministry next gen staff meeting, we start the meeting by sharing wins and stories. And what that does is kind of builds that culture of expectation that we're looking for them. So in huddles, we're asking about them. In every volunteer training, we're asking for them. In our staff meetings, we're asking for them. And so now we have a culture where we're looking for it, And I think hearing those stories is, and are you hearing them or are you not? What are the stories about? Are all the stories about people who are already inside the church, right? That's a good thing. But if you're not hearing stories about reaching new families, that would be a red flag, right? Or the opposite. I've never really seen that as much. But if all your stories about reaching people who are not a part of a church, and you're not hearing stories about people growing in their faith, becoming disciples, taking steps, again, that'd be a red flag. So I think that's the biggest thing. It's just hard because it's not, it's not black and white. But with that said, I think there are things we should measure and keep an eye on. And I've written a post before, I think about 6 or 8 family ministry measures that we can link to, but here are just a few that I think are helpful. And again, keep in mind, these are benchmarks. Every church is unique. You got to figure out, what is healthy for your church. One of the most important things about this is that you track it. That way you can compare to yourself year after year. It's not as much about, looking at other churches or even the benchmarks that I'll give you as it is about tracking your own growth there. So obviously most people measure attendance. I think measuring attendance year over year is helpful, especially in the long run. Don't look week to week. I don't really look too much month to month. I mean, it's too short of a time frame, but if you're looking year over year and at the trend, I think that's helpful. But the bigger thing that I think is helpful with attendance is percent of your church. So what is the children's attendance as a percent of your church attendance? What is the student ministry attendance as a percent of your church attendance? So I'll give you a couple things. Again, these are just benchmarks, but it would be typical for a church to have 18 to 23% of its attendance in children's ministry. So if a church had 500 total people attending on average, if 100 of that 500 were kids, that'd be 20%. That would be pretty normal. A lot of studies have shown the average is 20 or 21. We did a podcast with Anthony Prince from Ministry Architects where they found it was lower. I want to say it was like 15%. This is just my take. I would push for 20 and even a little above 20. But again, there are factors. If you're in an area that's highly populated with young adults, not families, like I know plenty of churches where 60% of their attendance is young adults, 20 to 30, mostly unmarried. You're not going to have that number, and that's okay. That's good. That means your church is doing just fine. So whatever your percent is, that's okay. If your church is older, like the average age is, 50 or above, or maybe it's even 40 in the mid 40s or above, it would be common again to not have that high percentage. One thing you can do is go to this website, thearda.com, and you can put in like your zip code of your church, a 5-mile radius, and it'll tell you some of these demographics. And my experience is that's a low bar. So if I did it just before we recorded just to see, in our church, the percentage of kids 10 and under using their numbers was about like 14%. So I think that's a low bar for the church. So, I mean, I think it's a helpful reference, but I certainly would not want our church, if our goal is to reach families and kids, to have, lower than that or even really too close to that number. So that can be helpful. On the student side, you hear all the time that 10% of the attendance is good. Again, it just depends. When our church launched, we were so young. Our lead pastor was 36 at the time. We didn't have many families with middle school, high school students. So we didn't get to 10% until literally like 3 years ago, like 7 years or 8 years in. But I do think that's a good guide. Again, it matters if your students meet during the service, you should have a higher percentage. If they meet Sunday night or another night during the week, it's probably going to be lower. But even then, I think 10% is good. So if our student ministry met during services, I would want to see a higher percentage than 10% if our age demographic met that. So that's, again, you can look at that, thearda.com, and see, does our percent of students, as a percent of our church match, or is it better than, because hopefully it's better than what the community is. So that's helpful. I think another measure is how many volunteers do we have each week as a ratio compared to how many kids or how many students. So if you, in children's ministry especially, a lot of people have rotating volunteer teams. So you want to look at, on an average week, how many volunteers do you have? If you have 10 volunteers on an average week and 50 kids, you have 1 volunteer for every 5 kids. If you have 500 kids and 200 volunteers each week, then you have 1 volunteer for every 2.5 kids, which, by the way, would be really, really high. You'd be doing really, really well. I think that's really helpful. Again, it's a benchmark. You can just kind of look at it and see. I think all of us know we want more volunteers, but where is that ratio for you? If you can get to that 1 to 4, 1 to 5, I can tell you from surveys we've done that would be the average, which means you'd probably be doing Okay. And that number actually holds up for children and for student ministry, which is interesting. I find that the student volunteer numbers are much lower. When when we do surveys or whatever, and that's not that surprising. I grew up in student ministry that was like that, 80 students and like 8 leaders or whatever, or less, because you can generally, if you have to, you can create the experience where if it's not small group based, you can kind of get by, but I would shoot for that 1-4, 1-5, or maybe even better ratio if you can. And again, that's a measurement of volunteer health, which I think impacts, the ministry. And then the last one kind of relates to the conversation we just had about coaches, and that's span of care. If you are leading, if you're like me and you're leading 60 volunteers, that's one leader for 60 volunteers. That's a really bad span of care because I couldn't care for 60 volunteers. If it's you and you directly lead 20, okay, you're 1-20. I would shoot for 1-10, 1-12, 1-15, maybe. Now you got to get there. I mean, if you're like I was, 1-60, okay, get one more person. So now each of you are 1-30 or whatever, or you're 1-50 and they're 1-10, whatever it might be. The whole point of the span of care number, though, is just to figure out, are you like Moses? Are you trying to lead far too many people with no help? Or have you started to give away some authority and some responsibility and recruit some people on board who can lead for you? So one way to figure that out is just, what is the total number of volunteers, that serve on your team, divided by how many people lead those volunteers. If it's just you, that's easy. That's your ratio. If it's 70 volunteers, it's 1-70. Say you have a couple people, you got 50 volunteers and there's 2 other people that help you lead them. Okay. You have 3 of you for 50 volunteers, 1-17, maybe. I don't know. I'm just making that math up right now, but so that you have 1-17. Again, that'd be better, I would think, than most churches. But that's a measure that I think is helpful. That one of the hard parts about measuring anything in ministry is, again, how do you measure life change? How do you measure growth? That's tough. I think tracking new families, baptisms, attendance, something like that's all really good. But I tend to focus more on what we can put into it and measure that, as opposed to what is coming out of it, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? So you measure the volunteers, measure how the span of care for those volunteers. I think it's more helpful to focus on those things that you control a little bit more, than the attendance itself. So those are some, you can measure things to death, and I don't think that's helpful either. I do love to jump in at different times and measure stuff. We just recently looked at like the frequency of attendance by grade, from birth all the way up through high school, which was interesting. It did not change much. So for anybody that's interested, the average kid comes a little less than half the time. The average student actually came a little more than half the time, which surprised me. I thought the student number might be less. It was actually more. In fact, some of them pushed like 3 out of 4 times. Now, our student ministry doesn't meet every week of the year. It's Sunday nights. It doesn't meet during the summer. I mean, there's probably 30 of those. So it's not quite the same, but anyway, so sometimes I like to jump in and measure something just to get a glimpse at it. And then, it may not be something that we keep tracking weekly or monthly or whatever. So I hope those are helpful, but it really all comes back to stories. I think you do those things is like just to get a pulse on something. And then you keep listening to the stories to see if you're winning or not.
Yeah, I know a lot of people in church world can have a tendency to wonder if numbers do matter, just because it is about life change and it is about people. But I know that in measuring the numbers, that then helps how are we winning and how can we continue to be a part of life change. So that's awesome. Now, I know that one of the biggest wins is when new families come. So when you reach people who aren't a part of any church and you get to introduce them to Jesus. So Chase actually was wondering, how do you follow up with these new families? You don't want to overwhelm them, but you also want them to know that you knew that they were there and that you care if they're coming back.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's not one way to do this. Rachel, you've been working hard on this resource that I mentioned earlier about what churches do, what they give to new families as part of that process. And I think, doesn't it even include some of the process? So it's the gifts plus the process. Is that right?
It does. And I know you have emails on your website as well that are emails that you guys onboard new families with to just help them understand what the environment looks like and what you would like to do for them.
We do. So that's all. That resource will come out soon. So if you're subscribed to the email list, you'll see it. Be it just a free PDF with like pictures of what churches give away and what their process looks like. I'll talk about what we do. I feel like we try to change it every 2 years because it's never, we always want to do a better job and you never, keep as many as you'd like. The book, What Every Pastor Should Know, suggests that most churches keep 20% of their first-time guests long term. Mm-hmm. We actually just dug into this at our church, and that number matched us. And we had years that were 27. We didn't really have many years under 19%. And I was hoping for better, and I definitely want to push, church-wide to be better. But the emails you mentioned is one thing we do. So here are just some ideas. I think one thing you could do when a family attends for the first time is give them something. Is there a gift for the kids? Is there, a fun toy? Is it candy? One of the guys we had on the podcast said in student ministry, they give them a full-size candy bar. I mean, it's not that expensive, right? So, but it's cool. Who doesn't want a candy bar if you're 16 or whatever? I mean, I want one right now. That'd be great. So that's one thing you can do is give away a gift. We write a note. So in student ministry, it comes from staff. In children's ministry, it comes from our welcome team, the volunteers. So before they've even left, that note is written and then it's mailed that week. And I think you gotta mesh this with like your church wide, process. You don't want people getting 7 emails or 10 contacts because you didn't, figure out what each other's doing. So we did that. We know like this is kind of meshes with our church wide process. So if a parent, has a kid, and they get on our list for that, and they're on the list because they filled out a card in the service, we've made sure that those work together. But we do send a series of follow-up emails, like you mentioned. People can link to that, and we'll link to that in the show notes, and they can get a copy of the emails we send. It's a series of 4 emails. It's kind of like an introduction to us and to the ministry area, each age group. And then the next 2 emails dive a little deeper. So what is the structure? What do we do in that time while we have your kid or your student? What we talk about small group leaders and how you should get to know them and, form a relationship there so we can serve your family best. And then the last email, I invite them actually. And I think you can do this even if you're, for large churches, our church isn't small. You can invite them to meet because not everybody's going to say yes. And if you're only keeping 20%, anyway, or even if it's 30%, I find this is not overwhelming, but you could do it by staff too. You could if your church is really large, you could, do this differently for each age group or rotate it or something like that. But for us, it's just an automated email series, but we try to make them sound personal. And the whole goal is to it's almost like onboarding, helping them understand, what they need to know about the ministry, about the church. And then once that's up, and we do that quick, they get 4 emails in 2 weeks. So it's like one every 3 or 4 days. Then we add them to our weekly parent email. And hopefully with the idea that now they know more about it. So they're not just coming in cold. And then beyond that, I think it's great to try to connect with them. That's the goal. To me, that's the goal of follow-up completely, is to make a personal connection that could develop into a relationship. So that's why our last email invites that. That's why there's the note. In student ministry, we try to do a really good job of connecting them with the small group leader, and then that small group leader makes the connection there. That's the goal, is to end up making a connection that will help people feel like I'm known here. I know somebody, I feel comfortable. So those are some ideas. We're messing with ours all the time. Rachel, I mentioned to you before we recorded that we're thinking about changing the email series so it looks even more personal. And maybe attaching the details in a nice PDF or something. So, or you click a link and you can read them. And all of that too would be the goal of making a connection personally. But we do, our series of 4 emails are, the open rate and all that's pretty good. It's over half for sure. And it goes down a little bit from the 1st to the 4th, but not that much. You'd be surprised. It stays pretty strong. So the idea has worked pretty well, but I'd love to see more. What we're not seeing is a good a response to that fourth email to connect. And so, or we're seeing some, but not enough. So I'm thinking about making it more personal, cause that's the goal. I mean, that's the goal is you don't want it to be some crazy automated system and it's never personal. The whole idea is to automate that stuff in order to help lead to a connection. But at the same time, our church is big on, as you know, Rachel, people moving at their own pace. So it's kind of like inviting them to that connection, but not pressuring them, So even the email that asks for them to make the connection is very like loose. It's kind of like, if you like, we'd love to put a face with a name or, that's not how it says it, but you know what I mean? It's open to where they can choose not to and not feel bad about it.
I think like you said, the personal touches and inviting them to connect is huge. I love that the parents get emails, which are easy for them to respond to, but then the child or student gets something in the mail, because I don't know about everybody else, but it's still very exciting to get something in the mail, especially because a lot of people, don't receive letters or postcards anymore. So that's something that they do at Gwinnett as well. Kids are sent personal postcards and then the parents get an email. I know that for students, it can also be super helpful when either the leader or whoever it is that they met follows them on social media after they first come. I know that a lot of students and leaders at Gwinnett have said that a student came back the next time and they were like, "Hey, why'd you come back?" And they were like, "Well, the student pastor followed me on Instagram. I had to come back." So I think that connecting with students in that way, if you have social media platforms, can be really helpful as well.
Yeah, that's a good idea. That's great. I mean, and for a student, that communicates so much, that you like followers, they want followers. And the fact that you followed means so much. That's true. That's really good.
Now we're going to shift gears a little bit again, more just towards ministry leaders and your role in the church. So Carol actually asked, what do you do if the position or the church is not what you thought it would be? It's not exactly what you thought you were getting into. How do you lead through that, and what conversations would be helpful to have?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's a tough place to be. One of the mastermind groups that we just wrapped up, I'd say half the one group was in this spot where, it's just not a good, healthy place. And me as the outside observer, because sometimes it's easy to say, it's not what I thought it would be. It's not healthy, whatever. And really it's petty. I don't want to say petty. That's not nice, but like it could be small things like Carol's email, clearly not a small thing. And I won't go into any details, but, so there's a huge difference between unhealthy and not what I would like, like not stylistic. I think it all matters, but there's a big difference there. But like that group, I mean, half of them were in situations where my opinion was, and again, I'm the outside observer, was I wouldn't stay there, which is hard. And so this is a tough conversation because I know someone who has said before that leaving a church should be like divorce. Like it should be that we should take it that seriously. Now they meant like attenders, mostly not staff, but the point is valid. It's not as easy because we do have like a church shopping culture to an extent where people bounce and that's terrible. We also know that I think it's gotten a lot better, but a long time ago, the average stay of a children or student pastor, especially a student pastor, was pretty short, 2 or 3 years, and you just can't get much done in 2 or 3 years. So here's what I would say. If you're in that place, one, definitely listen to the podcast episode with Jim Weidman, which was early on. See, this is where I can't remember. I'm like Carrie. I'm going to guess it was 5.
I think it was episode 4.
I think it was, okay. Look at you. See, you know it. We talk about that in that episode, and Jim has a resource called Stay or Go, where you answer a bunch of questions, and that is used to help you figure out kind of like, should I stay or should I go? And Jim, of course, runs, Next Gen Staff Solutions, helps connect church leaders with jobs. And so he's a great person to turn to if that's you. Clearly, you need to pray about it and submit to leadership for a while. It'd be easy to just something you don't like, something you discovered that you didn't know before you got hired, and you instantly turn it off. Obviously, if it's about sin, this is different, but a lot of times we need to submit for a little while, pray about it, and be open. I think that's important. The filter that I use, and I use this for people who are just church attenders or staff, the question you should really answer is, will I be used best by God in this church? Like, is there a match? See, a lot of people ask, like, when they're looking for a church, they're trying to figure out what they want in a church, like what will serve them best, what they will like the most. I think that's fine. That's not a bad thing. But the number one filter, especially if you're staff, should be, am I going to mesh well with this church's mission, vision, and strategy, their values? Is it going to match who I am and how I feel like God has wired me to lead really well? Theologically is really important. Obviously, I don't even think we have to talk about that. But sometimes we disregard this mission, strategy, culture kind of match. And I think that matters more than everything else. And I would say, this is where I could like get in trouble, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think we all know 80% of churches are plateaued or declining. It's not because they don't want to reach people. It's not because they're evil. It's not, I mean, these are good churches that love God. They care about people. For the most part, the problem is they have not changed the church to keep up with what is needed to reach people, to reach the people that are far from God. And so because of that, they are now at a place where they're not connecting with people who are apart from the church. And now their church is mostly about those who are on the inside. And so because that's most churches, my perception is, or my belief is that more people than not are in a position where they probably do need to move on. There probably is something where their church just isn't connected enough with how they are wired and want to do ministry, that they would be a better fit, at another church. So, and I just think life's too short to spend your time with, years and years and years at a church that ultimately you wouldn't even attend if you didn't work there. You know what I mean? Like I've heard that said before from Andy Stanley, your pastor's pastor, that like you should want to attend the church you work for. Is that true all the time? No. Maybe you're going to be part of changing it, when you get there. Is that 100%? No. It will never be done exactly how you do it. But if you wouldn't attend, if you didn't work there, that's a huge red flag. So I would say, get wise counsel too. Like what I'm talking about now is not really wise counsel because I don't know you and I don't know the church. And so like there's not, the wisdom that you need isn't going to be found in just something like this. I would get people who don't have a stake in the game. Like they're not tied to that church and, but they care about you, they love you, and they love God, and get their input as well. And then in the future, this is something that, and I think we talked about this in a couple episodes of the podcast, but you need to interview prospective churches just as much as they interview you, right? Like you got to figure out everything you can figure out. Ask every question, talk to multiple staff, talk to attenders, ask if you can sit in on meetings. And I know that's like, how do I do that? Like I'm trying to get a job there. They're interviewing me. I just know that if somebody did that for us, my respect for them would go way up. I'm like, okay, how to approach this. You care. You're really asking the right questions. That would raise my respect for someone. So I don't think we do nearly enough to interview prospective churches that we might work for. Just like I don't feel like actually churches do nearly enough either interviewing people. So I think both sides could do a better job of interviewing and digging and figuring out what's going on there. But I just, some people will see it differently, but I've seen far too many leaders, not use their time well at a church that ultimately they wouldn't even attend, if they didn't work there. And it's easy to watch 5 or 10 years go by and you'll have done some good work. I mean, it's a church. You're always going to hopefully make a difference, and that's a good thing. But I want to be used up in the biggest way possible. So that's what I would say. Don't send me angry emails if you totally see it differently and leaving church is more of a divorce thing for you, but that's my opinion.
I know that I actually know someone recently who took that approach of they really interviewed the churches that they were looking to work at. They were moving from Atlanta and they were actually moving up to the Northeast. And they said they actually felt like they had more questions for the church than the church had for them. And that raised kind of a red flag. So I think that that's a great idea to go in with questions that you have when you are looking to work at a church.
Yeah, that's another red flag when you have more questions than they do, or, a lot more. The reality is, leadership in a church, there's a few different versions, I guess not versions. There's different makeups of lead pastors or executive pastors or whatever that will be the primary leadership of a church, or elders, depending on how a church is structured. Some are going to be more pastoral. Some are going to be more teachers. Some are going to be leaders. And what that means is, and this is totally fine, where they're strong, there are going to be other places where they're weak. So if maybe they're strong teaching, maybe they're weak in leadership, maybe they're strong pastorally or weak in leadership, maybe they're strong in leadership. And a lot of times you get into a place where everybody is honoring God. I mean, they're trying to do the best they can, but it's not going to be a match for you because your strengths and weaknesses aren't going to match the staff. You're always going to be frustrated because of how that works together. Because ideally, it would all work together. That you look at the staff team, and if your church is really big, you look at kind of the departments, and hopefully that as a team, you're balanced. No one person is balanced, but as a team, you're balanced. And it is really hard when you get in a church that's either unhealthy, because of sin, or unhealthy because of leadership. That's a hard place to be. And I just personally would not, I would want to do everything I could to help change it, but I would not spend time there forever knowing that I'm not going to be as effective as I can be. I'm not going to be used up the way that I could be. So for what that's worth.
Well, I think that's actually all of the questions that we have time for, but thank you so much, Nick. This has been super helpful. Thank you for everyone who sent in questions. I know I learned a ton just listening and getting to talk with you and learn from you. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks for coming on and interviewing. Thanks for all you do behind the scenes. It's cool for everybody to get to hear from you. And this week, as we air this, obviously, we're giving stuff away here on the podcast and on the blog and email and social media and all that stuff, just to say thanks, because it's been great. It's been a great year. Everybody that's listening, you're the reason it's been great, along with these awesome guests that we've had. But your questions, your suggestions, people that I ask all the time for who are people that you want to hear from, and we just get great input there. So thank you for 1 year. I'm excited for another new year, and we got Kenny and Elle coming up, kind of kick off another new year. We'll hear from them and what they're doing. It'll be a lot of fun. So hopefully everybody subscribes and listens as we kick into a new year of the podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.